Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today here at Thomas Balch Library. My name is Nora Schneider. I am the Library Genealogy Associate. We are excited to have Andrew Jampoler here today for his presentation Through the Dark Continent, Henry Morton Stanley and the Exploration of Africa. I'm not going to take up too much time. I'm going to hand it right on over, but a few quick housekeeping. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box or the Q&A. Do not send them directly to Mr. Jampoler. Send them to Leesburg Events or the host, and I will make sure that he gets them at the end of this presentation. If for some reason you're having any technical difficulties, please email us at balchlib@leesburgva.gov. I will get that in the chat for you so that you can access it. This presentation is being recorded so that you will be able to access it in a few days. And with that, I am going to hand things over to Andrew Jampoler to begin Through the Dark Continent.
Nora, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone who has joined us for this conversation about Henry Morton Stanley, one of history's more remarkable explorers. A very quick comment, I'm grateful to you who are giving up this beautiful summer day, to sit with us and to hear the story of this quite extraordinary explorer and really odd human being. So we'll be talking about him. The next conversation will be a month from now. Another look at the Congo, this time a look at American interests in the Congo. The ones we'll be talking about today are largely European. Okay, let me get this to click down. Through the Dark Continent, Henry Morgan Stanley and the Exploration of Africa. The statue of Stanley lying there is one that is in the national park near the Congolese capital. It sits on a mountaintop facing what used to be called Stanley Pool. And this is a monument that is now broken into pieces, and his head is lying rather unceremoniously on the ground there. It's a picture I took some years ago when I was passing through Congo myself. There is an extraordinary interest in Africa during the period we're talking about. Here are some of the other explorers whose names are connected with Africa in the 19th century. James Burton, John Speke, Joseph Thompson, James Grant, Samuel Baker, and David Livingstone, who most people believe or recollect to have been a missionary, but whose, in fact, his principal interest and his principal business was the exploration of Central Africa. These are famous names in the business of exploration of the Dark Continent, and I invite your attention to them. There's a lot written about each of these gentlemen, and you'll easily find more information if you're interested about them. Stanley himself is the subject, I believe, of about 1,100 different books in the English language. This comes to me from WorldCat, the online catalog of books, that says there are over 1,100 books about or by Stanley in English, and these are several of them. And I invite your attention especially to the one on the right, Stanley, The Impossible Life of Africa's Greatest Explorer, by Tim Geel. This is, even though it's years old now, some years old, this is the definitive biography of Stanley, drawing on Geel's research in documents that were unavailable until then. It is a brilliant book. It is enormous and offers great insights into the man himself. Richard Hall's book about Stanley, Martin Dugard's book, Stanley and Livingstone, and Imperial Footprints, or all other books about Stanley. The one in the middle, highlighted in red, is a 2004 book by Tim Butcher, who was at the time a newspaper correspondent, and feeling this affinity with Stanley, who also wrote a great deal for the news, the Herald particularly, decided he himself would take a trip down the Blood River and sort of update people about what the Congo was and had become, since Stanley, his predecessor, had been down the river and into the area. It is a fascinating book, very dark, very pessimistic. I invite it to your attention as well. I went down the Congo about 6 years after Tim Butcher did. My own impressions are different from his, and we'll talk about those in the next lecture coming up in a month or so. Stanley himself, as you know, was not simply a newspaper correspondent, but also the author of a number of books, many of them, most of them, about himself. These are some of those titles. They begin in 1872 with How I Found Livingstone in Central Africa, and that catapulted, that book and his reporting in the Herald, the New York Herald newspaper, catapulted him to a level of fame that probably made him the best known person on the continent of Europe, or for that matter in the world, for the period of time that he lived. Tremendous attention to the discovery of Livingstone in Africa, and then he continued to write through the Dark Continent in 2 volumes. He wrote that in the space of a few months, and on and on. The autobiography of Sir Henry Morton Stanley, at the bottom right, published in 1909, edited by his wife, is fascinating reading, but it's highly suspect. I say that, and I'll explain myself in a moment, but I say that because almost nothing Stanley says about himself, about his origins, about his life, about his youth, almost nothing is true. It was all made up very deliberately with the idea of creating the person that he wished to have been and that he wished to be and to become. So be very skeptical reading about Sir Henry Morton Stanley, written by Sir Henry Morton Stanley. And I'll begin that comment, or elaborate on that comment, by saying even the name is artificial. There was no Henry Morton Stanley. He invented it. We'll talk a little bit about that invention and the invention of his persona and personality here in just a minute. Stanley published not only a number of books, many newspaper articles for the Herald and other papers, but also for many magazines. And all of these, thanks to the generosity of the web, not all, effectively all of them, are available online. And it's astonishing the range of magazines that he wrote for. Here are some examples, the Ladies' Home Journal being one of them, Century, Midwinter Century being one, Scribner's Magazine another. It is easily possible to troll the internet and find these original statements by Stanley in his various outlets, specifically these magazines, and quite oddly to my mind, as they say in the Ladies' Home Journal. Here he describes how he found Livingstone and what that was to mean to him and to others. Stanley also published a number of books, including the exploration diaries of Henry Stanley, published by Richard Stanley in 1961. These are his diaries that he wrote, compounded into a book. He also had other volumes, you'll see that on your right, other reports of his expeditions and explorations in his own words, not originally designed for publication, but published by others in any case. So, who was Henry Morton Stanley? Let's begin by saying he was John Rowland's. He was born into an impoverished family, the first of his mother's 5 illegitimate children. In the town of Denbigh in Wales, there's a map of the British Isles in front of you marking Denbigh. Born there in 1841, and right now in the center of Denbigh, in that photograph on your right, stands the statue of Henry Morton Stanley, John Rowland's, as I say, was his birth name, with his hand out in that classic moment where he's greeting Dr. Livingstone, supposedly saying Dr. Livingstone, I presume. That turns out to be a fantasy as well. He never said that. In any case, Stanley Rowlands is born in Denbigh, Wales, and he will live miserably there, neglected by his mother, neglected entirely by his father, who's reportedly the village drunk. During the years of his youth, after the death of his grandfather, when Stanley was 5, he will be moved to what amounts to a workhouse, the St. Asaph Union Workhouse. This is a ledger of that workhouse showing the admissions and discharges. On the bottom left is a photograph of the workhouse's young tenants. They had adults in there as well. Stanley will spend his youth in this workhouse, learning how to read, suffering miserably for the lack of attention from his mother and his unknown father, and being embittered by the process. Although, as near as we can tell now, it was about as successful as you would expect such an institution to be, in that he emerges from this as a young teenager, embittered but literate, capable and independent. There's a photograph of the youngsters there, and it makes you really grieve to see something like that. The discharge book at St. Asaph's Union Workhouse is shown there, and you'll see John Rowlands is being discharged, gone to his uncle and on to the rest of his life. He will spend the rest of his life concealing this heritage, concealing this experience, and reconstructing it in ways that are much more flattering and much more palatable. He will never be reconciled with his mother, whom he meets with several times during the course of his life. In each instance, she rejects him, and he is crushed by that experience. Stanley leaves the workhouse. He works briefly in the harbor area, and then finally in November 1958, as a youngster, he boards a ship, the ship Windermere, sailing from Liverpool to New Orleans, and he will be a cabin boy on that ship. He gets to New Orleans, but the experience is miserable. He will leave the ship, jump ship, meaning that he doesn't get any salary for that. And he is now in New Orleans, and he begins the business of reconstructing his life as he would wish it had been, and as he would wish it was to be. This is an illustration of the Windermere sailing on another cruise, and there from Courier and Ives is a look at mid-19th century New Orleans on the river. Incidentally, that's a fascinating book about fast sailing ships, their design and construction. During the course of this, unfortunately, one-way conversation, I'll mention a number of books. They're all listed on my website. They'll all be available to you through this presentation as well. And I encourage your interest in them. I found them to be fascinating, and I hope you will as well. There's a period of a few years where Denby is on the ground. He will rename himself Henry Morton Stanley. His explanation will be that he met a cotton merchant in New Orleans, a model man, and that merchant adopted him. And that merchant's name was Henry Stanley, Henry Snow Stanley, as I recall. And Henry Morton Stanley will develop this legend that he was adopted by this significant paternal figure in New Orleans, and that is where his life really begins. There was no such adoption. As near as anyone can tell, he came upon the name. It was a relationship he wished he had, so he adopted the name Henry Stanley and inserted the Morton there for reasons that nobody knows. The Civil War begins, and Stanley, like other young men in New Orleans, joins the Confederate Army. In his case, he will join the 6th Arkansas Volunteers, and they will go to war, and they will fight in the Battle of Shiloh. You see the paintings there illustrating this horrific battle of the Civil War. Stanley fights in that battle. He is captured by Union forces. He is taken from Shiloh to the great prison camp, Camp Douglas, the Union Army camp in the Chicago area, which is a combination prison camp, Army station, and he is held there. You see the picture on the top left of the prisoners sort of standing around aimlessly. Camp Douglas has been compared to Andersonville, the notorious Confederate prison camp that has become so infamous because of disease and starvation and maltreatment of the Union prisoners held there. I think that's overdrawn a little bit, but certainly there were sufficient horrors in Camp Douglas enough. Tremendous problems with disease, the control of disease. Prisoners were offered an opportunity to terminate their imprisonment by defecting and joining the Union Army. Stanley accepts this offer, and he will renounce his Confederate citizenship, his place in the Southern armies, and become a Union infantryman. There's an interesting book about these Yankees who defected, or who became Yankees by defecting from the South. That book, written by D. Brown some time ago, called The Galvanized Yankees. And galvanized in this case meant they had converted themselves from gray to blue. Stanley was one of these galvanized Yankees at Camp Douglas, and he will very briefly be a Union infantryman, very, very briefly, because he will desert and move on. He will head back for a while, back to England, back to Wales. He then returns in 1863, again on a sailing vessel, obviously, to the United States, when he joins the Union Navy and is assigned to the flagship Minnesota. Here, Minnesota is shown in 1861, bombarding the forts, southern forts, early in the war. Stanley was aboard her in 1863, very briefly. He deserted from the ship. Now he has the distinction, I think it's an absolutely unique distinction, of being the only person who served both in the Confederate Army, the Union Army, and the Union Navy, defecting or leaving all three surreptitiously. He then begins the life that we will know him as, begins life as, after having been the ship's writer aboard Minnesota, as a reporter, as a correspondent, and finally as an explorer and world figure. During the course of his young life, early on, he will meet James Gordon Bennett Jr. James Gordon Bennett is the son of his father, who was the editor and publisher of the New York Herald newspaper, and it is assignments from Bennett that will catapult Stanley first into public recognition, into the fame and status that he will enjoy going forward, beginning, as I say, as a newspaper correspondent working for the Herald. The Herald's a remarkable paper. This is now years before it merges with the Tribune to become the much better known New York Herald Tribune. But in this period, at the end of the 19th century, approaching the end of the 19th century, newspapers are the way that Americans learn about their world. That's in consequence of the development of cheap paper, the development of very high-speed rotary printing presses, the development of a very capable countrywide postal system. Newspapers become the way that Americans learn about the world, and they will remain that for a long time, right up until now almost, as the instruments through which people learn about current events, about the world outside their villages, their towns, their cities. That will be true even through the development of radio, which is the first great competition to newspapers, through the development of television, which will be the second great competitor. It's not clear to me that they will survive the development of the internet. This is a fascinating question to watch, but they're certainly threatened, and you can see that in the collapse of local papers and in the decline, not only in size, but distribution of the national papers. I think it'll be a great loss, but I think we're witnessing that process going on right now. In any case, Stanley begins writing for Bennett. Bennett is a very capable, very aggressive businessman, and he latches on to various international or national events that attract enormous attention and build circulation phenomenally. Many tens of thousands will buy the New York Herald on a daily basis to find out about their world. And Bennett does this by developing a very aggressive publicity, very aggressive presence, most famously perhaps before Henry Morton Stanley in the Arctic cruise of USS Jeannette. This is a picture of Jeannette. She was a British yacht before she became a U.S. Navy vessel. Bennett will send Jeannette up into the Bering Sea in a search for Arctic waters, polar waters. There is a belief at the time that there is a warm spot at the pole and that it's navigable. The North Pole is navigable up to the top of the globe. And Jeannette is sent there, prompted by Bennett and his money. Jeannette is sent there to explore this and coincidentally to report on the adventures and to pump up the circulation of his newspapers. The cruise of Jeannette will turn out to be a catastrophe. She departs San Francisco July the 8th, 1879. The ship will sink June 13th, 1881, casting her crew into 3 small boats in the Bering Sea in summer, granted in summer, but in horrific conditions. One of the boats will run aground, 2 others will reach the coast. There will be a handful of survivors from this horror story. These illustrations on the right show you the track of Jeannette up to the point where she sank, and then the drift of the ship in the ice, and the track of the 2 lifeboats. 3 boats were launched, the track of 2 of them, showing how the crew attempted to survive shipwreck under these horrific conditions up in what is today the Siberian coast. This, as I say, was a circulation building exercise on the part of the newspaper proprietor, and his interest in Stanley and his support of Henry Morton Stanley is driven by his notions that Stanley's reporting on his search for Livingstone can pump up the paper circulation handsomely. So he will become, for a period of a decade, a special correspondent to the New York Herald newspaper, and he will report specifically on Africa, but not exclusively. He will be reporting occasionally Turkey and other places on conflict, on conditions, and bringing this part of the world to the attention of the readers of the New York Herald. This is Stanley in 1870, the picture. Stanley will report on a number of conflicts in Africa and that part of the world, but what will make him famous and a global figure, will be the expeditions he conducts as a reporter, but and a representative of the Herald, but as an explorer of Africa nonpareil. I think it is fair to say Stanley then and Stanley today was the principal and most famous explorer of the continent of Africa. He did this across the course of 4 expeditions. And take a look at the right-hand side of the slide. The first is, and arguably the most famous, was his search for Dr. Livingstone. There illustrated on the right, the moment of greeting. The search was in 1871, 72. in Central Africa. He will mount an astonishing 3-year-long crossing of Central Africa from East Coast to West Coast on foot, obviously. That expedition will cover the entire waste of Africa and make him further famous under extraordinarily trying conditions. He will then, I think, be deceived by Leopold II, King of the Belgians, into serving Leopold's interests in Central Africa along the Congo in creating the stations that Leopold will ultimately develop into his privately owned personal colony. And this is 1879 to 1884. We'll talk more about that in the last lecture of this series. But it is probably what we know best about Stanley, or what is remembered best about him, was his service to the evil goals of Leopold, King of the Belgians, in creating a personal estate in Central Africa. His last expedition in Africa at the end of the decade will be searching for the German governor of the southern Sudan, a man named Emin Pasha, and this will be the Emin Pasha Relief Expedition, 1887, 1890. He will find Emin Pasha to discover that the Pasha, a German doctor, has no particular interest in being rescued from where he was. That will be an embarrassment, but it will be as well the fourth expedition he mounts in extraordinarily difficult conditions across Africa. So this very quickly is a glance at his career as a reporter, and specifically as a reporter in Africa. These arrows will show you the location of some of these expeditions. And let me pause here briefly to say that a couple of things about Africa at this time. We spoke in the last conversation about the institution of slavery and the successful effort to end that institution. First, the effort was successful in stopping the transportation of slaves across the South and North Atlantic to the New World. Only later, significantly later in some cases, was the reform effort to outlaw slavery, the ownership of people, finally successful. That success, those successes, are largely limited to North and South America. Slavery continued in the Arab world, with Arab slavers operating out of the ports of East Africa into the interior, infamously capturing black natives, bringing them back to Arabia as slaves, or working them as slaves and prisoners on the continent in an effort to extract that continent's wealth that was anything from ores, gold, and other ores, to ivory, a fabulously valuable commodity. Then, and still, the amount of ivory smuggling that's going on from Africa into the Orient is catastrophic even today. And ultimately, later we'll talk about rubber, the great precious resource of Africa. What we saw in the decline of European, North and South American slavery is not the decline of interest in the continent. What happens now is interest in Africa as a site for colonies, colonies of the metropolitan European powers, colonies that are hoped to be, thought to be, sources of natural resources, anything from gold, gemstones, other minerals, ultimately rubber. We'll talk about that in a minute. And also, bizarrely enough, markets. I say bizarrely because the peoples of Africa are almost without exception impoverished. The idea of developing markets for European goods or American goods in Africa seems bizarre in the period of time we're talking about. But as you'll hear me say in the next lecture, the United States' interest in setting up diplomatic representation in what is today Congo was driven by the notion not simply of resources, but the idea of markets, that somehow the impoverished peoples of Africa who needed everything were going to be able to buy the products of the mills, the fields, and the mines of America. So Africa dwindles in perception as slavery is outlawed, but it becomes increasingly important, and there is an intense competition that develops at the end of approaching the end of the century, especially among the European powers, competing intensely for colonies in Africa. And the first dimension of this competition is understanding just what it is. Where are the places in Africa that represent potential colonies, that represent potential resources and markets, and the explorations of the continent that will include people like Henry Morton Stanley, and there are many like him. Those explorations are driven by this colonial competition that replaces the competition for extracting the citizens of Africa and introducing them into slavery. British operations in Abyssinia. This is the military engagements, efforts to take over land, to take over peoples, and to gain political power and influence in these places that appeared to Europeans to be candidate colonies. If you look at the map of Africa, this is an 1870 map and a fairly well-developed one. You'll notice the center is blank and large spaces to the north and south of the continent are blank as well. In parallel with the interest in colonization and the interest in resources came a recognition that Africa was not understood. It was a dark continent for many reasons. One of them was that very little light had been shed on its geography, on its geology, on its resources, on its transportation routes. And some of this was purely intellectual. The search for the sources of the Nile, for instance, continued and consumed the attention of many people. Just where was the origin of this fabled river that had played such an enormous part in Mediterranean history? So the hunt for the sources of the Nile, the hunt for the sources of the Congo River and other of the great rivers of the continent consumed the interest of explorers and of reading publics through this period of time. Any effort to understand Africa was complicated by a number of things. The logistics of moving around the country obviously were enormous complication, but there were two others. Disease was the principal one, and of those of disease, there were two others, malaria being one of them, and sleeping sickness being another. The map on the bottom right shows you the extent to which malaria is endemic in the continent of Africa. The great central swath of the African continent is home to this disease, and only recently has it been understood enough to be controlled and protected against, but we still see epidemics of it. And in the period of time we're talking about, the 19th century, even to the late 19th century, there was no understanding at all of a way to control this and to cure it. The cartoon on the left shows Sergeant DDT holding up a mosquito as a control technique. The rather odd-looking map on the top shows you by size and distortion the incidence of the disease on the continent. So malaria was one of the great obstructions to the exploration and the development of the continent of Africa. No less so was sleeping sickness. Brought by the tsetse fly, there's an illustration of the fly there on the top, the disease cycle to the left, the distribution of the disease in the bottom left, and more currently, the case counts in the bottom right. The tsetse fly itself was, excuse me, let me shut that down. The tsetse fly itself is the explanation for the fact that exploration in the Congo had to be done by porters carrying loads on their heads. These loads, 60 pounds typically, loaded heads, carried all the material that an expedition needed because it was impossible to take horses or other beasts of burden through the Congo in the face of the tsetse fly and in the face of the fatal diseases that the fly carried. So when you look at expeditions that had hundreds of porters, each of them carrying typically 60-pound loads, you'll recognize the reason for this was the impossibility of using beasts of burden successfully in this continent. Stanley's, the noise you hear is our young dog scratching his dog tags. I apologize. Susie is going to get him out of here. Stanley's expedition searching for the missionary Livingstone followed this track across Central Africa, and he successfully found Livingstone at the town of Ujiji there in Central Africa. You see a map on the left and then an elevation map on the right that'll give you a better sense of the geography. This was an enormous expedition supported by the paper because of the great interest in the missionary Livingstone, the fact that he had disappeared, and the great anxieties about his health, about his condition. And Stanley successfully found Livingstone in Central Africa after a trek from the Pacific Ocean, as you see there, across into the middle of Africa. And that discovery of a man who had been sought emotionally and passionately by the British reading public, but by the English-speaking public throughout the world, that triumph in 1872 made Stanley into a global figure, a heroic explorer, an extraordinary success, and a man who everything he said, everything he wrote, fascinated people and became a part of exploration history. This is an illustration of the discovery of Livingstone. You see the two in an etching there, meeting where Stanley greets Livingstone. The date is not clear. It was November 1871, but both of them had lost track of the days. It was sometime in the second week of that month. And this greeting represents that moment when the explorer greets the missionary under the American flag. Stanley is traveling with an American flag in his expedition and is supposed to have uttered those famous words, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. It's clear now that those words were never spoken. Stanley invented that greeting later as he was writing up the moment, looking for a sufficiently portentous phrase to arrest the attention of his readers. But the book from his journal, the page from his journal that covers this day, has suspiciously been torn out, and the speculation is that he tore it out because it would demonstrate that he never said those famous words, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. This is a film that shows that moment. As I suggested to you, that phrase was never spoken, but you can see the drama dripping from the moment. And that moment, that success would catapult Stanley to the minds of the Western world. And he stands today, I think, fairly still as the best known and most famous explorer in history. A number of movies made about that moment. The posters there on the left. If you're interested, you can download them. They're available. I think they're fun to watch, but don't take them as history. Livingstone is typically described as a medical missionary. His biographers have looked at this carefully, Gila specifically, and concluded that he actually managed to convert one of the natives to Christianity, and that conversion was quickly unsuccessful as the convert backslid and no longer professed the faith. Livingstone, like Stanley, was an explorer. He was attempting to establish what the headwaters of the Nile were. He believed those headwaters could be found in the lake systems of Central Africa, and he got himself in parlous straits, in dangerous condition, running out of food, running out of health, and he was rescued by Livingstone, and that rescued by Stanley, and that rescue created the giant figure of the explorer that Stanley became. They spent some months together exploring the lake systems of Central Africa. These are illustrations that show that. Livingstone would die there, and his body would be returned to England, where it would be buried in state. Stanley reports on the Ashanti Wars. These are in the fought on the bend of Africa, on the west coast. He reported as a correspondent during those wars, explaining to Americans and his readers, his global readers, what seemed to be going on. More famous or more significant in my mind than the expedition to find Livingstone was the extraordinary 3-year hike, the trek across the waist of the continent, the belly of the continent, that waist, across Central Africa from 1874 to 1877. He traveled with a large party of bearers and a number of Europeans as well, explorers. He was subjected to disease. He had malaria, all kinds of other problems. Astonishingly, and one of the things that you need to remember about Stanley was he had an enormously vigorous constitution. He managed to survive and shrug off the diseases that were killing his fellows, killing his counterparts, killing his associates in horrific numbers. The diseases I mentioned to you, malaria specifically, but others as well. So the idea of crossing the waist of the continent, you see it here, that river system right in the middle, incidentally, is the Congo River. Crossing the waist of the continent is just an extraordinary achievement and reason enough for the fame that this man was to enjoy then and in history since. A closer look at it, I hope you can see the faint red lines that begin just west of Zanzibar, Zanzibar here, right there. Can you see my arrow? And there is his track across into the center of the continent and back out the other side, back the western side of the continent, successfully and out towards the Atlantic. And that small mapped inset on the top left will give you a larger look at this. But you see Lake Victoria and all that lake system that so fascinated geographers, and especially the geographic societies in Britain and the rest of Europe, wondering just what was in this continent. How was it assembled? How was transportation made possible? In this case, it was all on foot by porters. And extraordinary achievement. The idea of living and marching across the continent across 4 years under those conditions is just a stunning, stupefying thing to think about. This is a close-up of the end of that expedition, and this is the Congo River around this great bend down towards what will become called Stanley Pool, through the rapids, and then to the Atlantic, to the South Atlantic. You see, if you're able to read it carefully, the name of this particular river is the Livingstone River, or the Congo. It was never called by anybody for any length of time the Livingstone River. It has been the Congo ever since. There's a pool on that river right near the capital, the Congo capital today, that for a long time was called Stanley Pool. It's not called that any longer anyway. But this is the trek around the river that established the arc of the great river system of the continent. Stanley had two loves in his life. Alice Pike Barney, there on the left, who was a teen when he met her. They were engaged with the understanding that she would remain engaged and marry him when he returned in 2 years' time. Stanley named his boats that he used on the river Alice, Lady Alice. When he finally returned from his expedition, it was years later, it was to discover that she had been married for several years. She'd abandoned her engagement to him at the 3-year mark, and he had promised her only 2. So he lost that first lady love. He was to have another one. This is Stanley in Africa, a book about Stanley that has these illustrations in it. And the boat that you see is the boat he named after Alice, the Lady Alice. It was fairly small enough to be transported by porters and then helped him navigate down the river systems. But Lady Alice, as I say, gave up on him when he didn't emerge on schedule and married someone else. Stanley's relation with the Royal Geographical Society, the principal society, Geographic Society, obviously, of the United Kingdom, was awkward from the very beginning. They viewed him as a commoner, a parvenu, as an attention-seeking news hound, and not as a serious scholar, not as an educated and trained geographer. And the relationship was awkward or hostile, better than awkward, throughout. And this will continue for the rest of Stanley's career. This is over here on the right, the symbol of the Royal Geographical Society. They finally agreed to let him speak to the society. They didn't like what they heard. They didn't like who they were hearing it from. And the tensions between the two remained throughout his career. The expedition Stanley should be best known for is the expedition to Congo 1879-1884. This was in the service of Leopold II, King of the Belgians. These illustrations show you some aspects of the cartoons of that period and the event of that period. Leopold was fascinated by the Central Congo because he saw it as a source of great treasure and personal wealth for him. The Belgian government, the Belgian parliament, had no particular interest in the Congo. It was the king himself, and he maneuvered furiously and successfully to the point where he would have the Central Congo as his personal property for a period of years and extract from it at great expense to the population, extract from it whatever wealth he could recover. That was principally in those days in the form of ivory, although towards the end of that period, rubber became a valuable commodity, first because of its use in bicycle tires, and soon enough because of its use in very early automobiles. But this is not during Leopold's era. In any case, Leopold ran the Congo as his personal estate, his personal property. He managed to persuade other Europeans to acknowledge that, and he ran it with stunning cruelty. The violence inflicted on the natives was extraordinary. The control that that violence gave him was what he sought. Stanley had been recruited to do the exploration of the river basin and to negotiate the agreements with the local chieftains that Leopold would translate into deeds and into his ownership of that vast property. There's some illustrations of Stanley and his Congo explorer guys. There on the left are illustration of the boats in sections that were used to help him move along the rivers. The bottom left photograph is one of Stanley's actual boats that has been preserved to this date, and he will be the tool of the emperor, the Belgians, the king of the Belgians, excuse me. I mentioned to you earlier that slavery continued in Africa, although it was no longer exporting its sad product to the New World. Tipu Tib was one of the infamous Arab slavers that was in Central Africa during the period Stanley was. Stanley met him and knew him. There's an illustration of some of Tipu Tib's war canoes moving down the river, down the Congo, and there are illustrations of him on the left. The the king of the Belgians' control of this vast private property was ruthless, bloody. Discipline was very harsh. It included amputation. It included execution. There's a political cartoon of that period. The Belgian Congo became Belgian only after Leopold. The parliament reluctantly took it over, and then it got its independence here several decades ago. But it is an extraordinarily dark period. I mean, no pun with that. In the continent's history, Leopold was an evil man. The extent of his evil is being recognized, I think, more generally in Europe today as statues honoring him are being taken down, removed, and as the record is being corrected in museums and other documents. This same statue that lies here of Stanley in the ground in that museum site in Congo, a neighboring statue has Leopold on horseback. That statue has also been removed for a period of time. It was meant to be in the capital, on the ground in the capital in Kinshasa. The instrument of the Europeans apportioning out the continent was the Berlin Conference, hosted by the Kaiser. There's the dates, 84 to 85. And in this conference, judgments were made about who would get which piece of Africa, how it would be distributed, and that was effective through the end of the period of colonization, until fairly recently, incidentally. The last of Stanley's expeditions was an expedition meant to rescue Emin Pasha. There's his portrait down there, a Turkish MD. He was, a German MD. He was a Turkish official, the governor of Equatorial Sudan, apparently under some sort of a threat, and Stanley was asked to mount an expedition to rescue Emin Pasha. There is his fourth and last expedition, the track past Lake Victoria and into the center of down the Arowumi River and into the center of Africa to rescue Emin Pasha, who had no particular, as it turned out, interest in being rescued. If you look here, that we're now here on the Arowumi River, right here is the intersection of that river with the Congo River, and if we proceed upriver on the Congo slightly, right to here, there is Stanley Falls, named, of course, after Henry Morton Stanley. It is the end of navigation on the Congo River, and here it's from here downriver. It's possible to navigate all the way to the Atlantic. The only obstruction being several hundred miles of violent rapids just the other side of the capital, Kinshasa, which Stanley didn't understand. He had succeeded in taking boats down what is called Stanley Falls, when he got to the other side of the pool, the other side of what is today the capital, he headed into 200 miles of very rugged rapids, and that enormously complicated the development of Congo because everything had to be carried around there, and it was carried on porters, 60-pound loads at a time. This is the fighting that Emin Pasha was being rescued from, paintings to illustrate the fighting down in Darfur and other places. There's an excellent movie, or a fun movie, excellent, excessive, a fun movie that starred Charlton Heston that showed these battles going on. There are also some products, chocolate being one of the very few products of the area. There are also some products advertised in to your left there, and you'll see Emin Pasha appears on both of these chocolate products as a trademark for those products. This is the meeting between Stanley and Emin Pasha, his rescue, and the discovery that the Pasha had no particular interest in being rescued and no particular interest in leaving. Stanley's exploration of Africa, of the Congo, reignited all the anxieties, all the concerns, all the unhappiness in Europe about the institution of slavery, the treatment of slaves, of black people in general, more recently. And he is still associated with that debate and with that sad history. He is a key figure during the scramble for Africa that we talked about, this division of the cake that's Africa in the top left-hand corner, and the competition, the European powers, each of them seeking some resources and some presence. Stanley appears memorialized in music. This is Stanley's Grand Triumphant March, a book, Twain and Stanley Enter Paradise. He will be honored despite the lack of respect from the geographers of the United Kingdom. He will be honored by award of a knighthood, the Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath. He will be a member of Parliament for several years, representing the Liberal Unionist Party. There's a political poster on the left there. And in the middle is a portrait of Stanley in all his official regalia, bemedaled and looking very serious and very successful. Stanley ended up marrying a second fiancée, Dorothy Tennant. There she is in a painting by Watts, George Frederick Watts. She painted him in the painting to the other side, and they remained, married for years, but childless. Some photographs of the couple appear here. Stanley was then and is today, I've attempted to persuade you, the greatest explorer of history, certainly the greatest explorer of one of the great unknown continents of the world, Africa, and a giant figure. It is no surprise then that there are hundreds of books in English and many others written about the man who during those 4 expeditions crossed the continent and changed our understanding of its geography, of its population, and of its potential. Our next talk will focus on the American interest in the same continent, specifically in the same drainage basin of the Congo River. It is the biography of Lieutenant Emery Taunt, United States Navy, who sent up the river, the Congo River, to explore its resources, to explore its potential as a market, who ends up being the first American resident diplomat in the Valley of the Congo, and who ends up very soon thereafter dead of disease and alcoholism, yet another victim of the Congo and its inhospitable character. I thank you for your time and attention. It's kind of you to have joined me on such a beautiful day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you so much for that very informative presentation, as usual. If anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat box or the Q&A, and we will get to those. I know that you will be talking more about this topic in our next presentation on the Congo. So without kind of giving anything away, could you talk a little bit about how you got interested in Henry Morton Stanley and your research process about his life and his expeditions?
I can. I That began with my interest in Lieutenant Emery Taunt, United States Navy, who I discovered in the course of my readings had been ordered up the Congo River by the United States Navy in the 1880s. And I said to myself, what possible reason would the Navy have to be interested in the Congo River Valley? And as I began that research and began reading about the Congo, inescapably I read more and more about Henry Morton Stanley because he is the great commanding figure of that geography. And so, in parallel with my research for the book, I started getting increasingly interested in Stanley and read more and more about him. And this talk, this conversation we've just had about him, is a derivative of my research for my book about the Congo, uh, and my preparations for going down the river itself. As I started to write or think about writing that book, Susie, my wife, said, how is it possible to write about someone on the Congo River without having been there, without having experienced that? And she was right, of course. And we put together our own expedition. My son and I spent some weeks beginning at Kisangani at the headwaters of the river, where it used to be called Stanley Falls, uh, in a small boat going down the Congo River, by truck around the rapids, and a yet smaller boat down the rest of the river to the Atlantic at Banana Point. And all of that derived from, first, being interested in Emery Todd, second, discovering the commanding position that Stanley had among explorers of that, and then finally experiencing life on the river myself, um, which was an extraordinary experience that we'll talk about in a month or so. But that's that's why. And I don't pretend to have read most of those 1,100 books about Stanley, but I've read a lot of them. And the ones that appear in this presentation, the ones I recommend to you and to others who are fascinated by this figure of a man who invented himself from very modest beginnings to become a giant in the public life of the Western world.
Yes, everyone should definitely join us for your presentation on the Congo, which is on Wednesday, April 27th, for more information about your experiences with that and your writing of the book. You mentioned a little bit about the controversy revolving around the expeditions and King Leopold and Stanley. We are seeing that a lot more often now with the re-examination of a lot of the expeditions, not only in Africa, but also in South America and Central America and Asia. Can you talk a little bit more about how the new magnifying glass that's being put on these expeditions is also impacting the history of the explorers themselves?
That's a yes. Um, what we're going through is a sort of a reappraisal of what exploration is, its impact on the places explored and the peoples who are resident there. And I think we're coming to have a conscience about this, especially here in the United States, where we're re-examining our history fundamentally as a consequence of the reinspection, the re-examination of the era of slavery and what followed it, and the extent to which what followed has been incomplete and inadequate. Uh, the same kind of a process of sort of rethinking norms, social norms, rethinking who wrote the history and whose service that history was, is happening in many places along the valley of the Amazon, along the Congo, The reason that this focuses on rivers is because rivers were the great highways of the period. This is the way people got in and out of places that were otherwise inaccessible or very difficult to access. So it's no surprise that river valleys, I mentioned the Amazon, but there are others, uh, see a lot of attention recently to history as people think through the treatment of native peoples, the treatment of the environment, the consequences of both of those on the world as it is today. And here in the United States, of course, we're in a great reappraisal, re-examining our history, what the Civil War meant, what it produced, re-examining the era that followed, the era of Jim Crow, and thinking very seriously about how do we compensate peoples who are the survivors and inheritors of that history. Um, an intensely complex introspection that uh, we're consumed with today in our schools and in our society. Um, Stanley was an equivocal figure. He the current reading is he was duped by Leopold. He did not understand what Leopold's motives were. Uh, the agreements he struck with the kings of the Congo, the various tribal chieftains, he did not interpret the way Leopold did. Leopold interpreted those agreements as being given a deed to essentially an ownership deed to those peoples and properties. Uh, it's a fascinating period in time now as we very seriously reconsider uh, racial relations and our history and reinterpret what the storytelling of the past was into terms that reflect the social consciousness of today.
Well, I thank you for your presentation today. We look forward to your next presentation on the Congo in April, and I thank everyone for joining us today, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your afternoon.
And my thanks to you all, and I promise you after this next talk, we'll find something else other than the Congo to spend some time on, but I'm grateful for your time and attention today.
Have a great day, everyone. See you for our next presentation.
Bye-bye.